year. I'm also a second year M-Plan student. I would just like to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone that has contributed so far. The presentations and discussions have been amazing. I'd like to also welcome everyone back, and I hope you've enjoyed the session so far. For our final session, we will be looking at the international perspectives, and we have some really exciting speakers to kick it off. So firstly, we have Dr. Rui Yang. She is the RTPI president, and we are really delighted that she could join us here today. Due to her schedule, Dr. Yang will unfortunately not be able to join us for the Q&A session. However, if you have any questions and answers, please feel free to drop them into the question and answer box. Without further ado, I will let Dr. Yang take the virtual floor. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Wei Yang, president of the Royal Town Planning Institute. I'm really delighted to join the UCC Planning Society conference today. UCC is an accredited planning school of the RTPI, so I feel quite special about today's talk. So if I may share my screen. Can you see it? Okay.
That's perfect.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Hi. I'm really quite impressed by the topics we're talking about today, about nature-based solutions and livable cities for all. I think they are directly relevant about a bigger picture about how we should plan the world we need, which is the topic I want to discuss today. If I may introduce about the RTPI first. The RTPI is the UK's leading professional body representing town planners. We are the largest in Europe with over 26,000 members in over 80 countries worldwide. The RTPI is a chartered institute, so responsible for maintaining professional standard and accrediting world-class planning courses nationally and internationally. So we are a charity with the purpose to advance science and data planning for the public benefit. And we are a learned society, so leading policy debates and setting a research agenda for the profession. So to do all this, we support and represent our members and promote the value of good planning. For me, I have been a member since 2010, started from associate member. Now I'm a fellow, and I have become the president this year. I think actually the reflection I take from my involvement with RTPI is that joining the RTPI is not only, say, benefiting myself from my career-wise to be a qualified planner. I think more importantly, it's also about to act together through the institute to make stronger professional impacts for the benefit of the public. So why planning profession is so important? I think we had lots of discussion already about climate change and biodiversity, especially around nature-based solutions. This decade, the 2020s, is a crucial time to tackle the climate and the biodiversity emergency. 80% of the people around the world believe we are heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. So action is being taken, but change has started to occur, but in my opinion, certainly not at the speed required. The RTPI published several reports on climate change and biodiversity issues. Yesterday, we published a new report called Place-Based Approaches to Climate Change. So the report explores how embedding planning and climate change in a place-based approach can help local authorities achieve recommendations set by the UK Climate Change Committee's report, Local Authorities and the Sixth Carbon Budget. Because currently, if you think about how we tackle the climate change issues, it's mainly based on sector-by-sector basis. But actually, planning can provide a spatial-based solution, can efficiently and systematically join everything up, so we can have a much more efficient system. And at the same time, we can promote a low carbon lifestyle. So all the things promoted by different sectors can be achieved by the end users. And also, according to the State of the Profession Report 2020, architecture and planning has been listed as second of the top 10 occupation for sustainability. So it's really a high time for the planning profession to flourish and grow. I think COVID-19, we can all see, changed every aspect of our life. Inequality has been exposed under the sunlight. The disproportionate of COVID-19 impact on vulnerable groups, especially ethnic minority communities and older people living in deprived neighborhoods have been affected the most. To investigate how the pandemic has affected health inequalities in England, UCL Institute of Health Equality published a new report, Building Back Fairer, the COVID-19 Mammoth Review. The report highlights that the inequalities in social and economic conditions before the pandemic contributed to the high and unequal death toll from COVID-19. Spatial inequality, I think we talk a lot. We talk about that quite a lot last year. So, for example, for ethnic minority groups, I think people generally have smaller gardens or they are less accessible to green spaces. So this space inequality is a direct reflection of social and economic inequality, and vice versa. Spatial inequality triggers further social and economic inequality. This year, 2021, the United Nations, the General Secretary, actually I think at the very beginning, he set up the priorities for 2021. These priorities include COVID-19 response, gender equality, climate and biodiversity, poverty and inequality, sustainable, inclusive recovery, and many more. In addressing these priorities, he emphasized, now is the time to secure the well-being of people, economies, societies, and our planet. It is possible, so we must act now to make it happen together. So I think this together message is very, very strong. It's very true, we have to act together. So what we can do as town planners, the pandemic gave us a chance to pause, think, and reflect. As a town planner, and of course, I'm also a member of the general public, I observe my life more in detail than I've ever did. So the things worked and didn't work keep reminding me the purpose of planning. Because the purpose of the planning is about people, their health, and well-being. Once I was asked to use 3 words, which I think associate with the planning profession the most, I chose 3 words: compassion, selflessness, and creativity. Because I think these are the first 2 are the moral foundations of our profession, and the creativity is the nature of our profession. So I think we really need to emphasize more on the social aspect of our profession. We need to ensure everyone has a decent home with essential access to shops, green spaces, schools, and jobs. It all sounds very simple and common sense, but in reality, it's not really happening everywhere. So planning can play a key role to help tackle all these problems and join everything up. And also we can say, actually I said earlier, planning can play a key role to help cultivate a low carbon lifestyle. So well-planned neighborhoods can encourage greater level of walking, cycling, and outdoor activities. During last year, I was interviewed by Sunday Times about 15 minutes neighborhood because 15 minutes neighborhood has become a very hot topic because the Paris mayor put that in her manifesto. So during my interview, I keep saying actually it's a great idea, but it's not a new idea because from the journalist, he said it's a new idea. I said it's not a new idea. So I tried to convince him to say actually in Vanessa Howard's book, Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, was all talking about walkable neighborhood and accessible local jobs and shops, everything else. But he was not convinced. So eventually, actually, I gave him a list of all the essential facilities we should have in the 20 minutes neighborhood. That's how UK use it. And then I provided him a quite abstract, just a text, a list. And then he came out with this diagram. As you can see, it's very straightforward and understandable by the general public. So actually, that teach me lessons. I think how to make our profession to be better understood by the public. We really need to think about. We need to learn from the journalists to think about how we can communicate our ideas better, so we can have better connections with the public. So actually, enhancing public appreciation of the planning profession is one of my key priorities during my presidency. And last year, the RTPI launched a major campaign, Plan the World We Need. It aims to raise awareness of the vital role planners can play in the recovery in order to revive the economy, tackle inequality, and meet net zero targets by 2050 in the UK. We argued that we need a holistic, integrated, and resourced approach in planning. planning covers such a wide range of issues. From the very beginning, the founder of the RTPI, Thomas Adams, that was in 1914. Actually, he said the RTPI, at the time called the TPI, was a forum for all environmental specialists and is a sponsor of planning research. So actually, there wasn't a defined boundary for planners. I think we should have a much wider multidisciplinary skills, especially for these skills we need to tackle all the global grand challenges. And in this crucial moment of time, also, I think we need to think globally and act locally. As president, I attend the Global Planners Network meetings. And after our discussions meetings, I often have a very strong sensation because I realize actually, as planners, we face very similar challenges worldwide. And then it is urgent to raise the profile of planning. And the planners around the world, we should be united to tackle all these challenges together. And we need to find innovative and sustainable solutions to tackle the world's biggest challenges, ranging from poverty to climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, from inequality to humanitarian crisis, from pollution to public health crisis. Last week, I launched the RTPI International Strategy 2021 to 2030. The strategy is centered at a vision for planning as a positive force for global sustainable development. It is focused on a mission to empower our members to lead our action internationally. So the new international strategy will facilitate collaborative actions across the Institute's membership and inspire further engagement with wider stakeholders worldwide, including the Irish Planning Institute. So to serve our community in a globalized 21st century, of course, we need to understand people's changing attitudes and opinions. Even before the pandemic started, actually people's attitudes and opinions have already gradually changed. So along with the implications for business, government, and society. There's a very famous sentence, I think I have been quoting that quite a lot from the Global Trends 2020. It says, technology has changed the fabric of our world, but it has not changed the structure of it. So the fundamental social issues, inequalities are still there. So it's actually, if it's not even worse, it's still as challenging as 100 years ago. So it's not something we should forget in our profession. So one of the biggest challenges we now face is the loss of the future. So people today, they realize actually we all have our own roles to play in creating a world we all want to live in. So we need to grasp this changing attitude and opinions of people of the planet. Although COVID-19 has impact on every aspect of our life, but if we look at the positive side, it has created a greater focus on a sense of local and generated a stronger community spirit. So this is changing the way how communities want to engage and how people want to have their say. Recently, RTPI published a report called The Future of Engagement. So we took interviews for both professional planners and also the general public. It's really interesting. More than half of the general public surveyed felt that in order to adapt to post-pandemic life, change to local places and services are needed. And local people should be involved in making these decisions. Already we know when we have public consultation events in local communities, it's only certain demographic group join, they are more active. But now actually we found out more people are willing to get involved in local decision making now. 63% feel they could be motivated to participate in the future. 56% of young people aged 16 to 34 think communities need to reduce carbon emissions and adapt to climate change and want to be involved in those decisions. So as the RTPI president, I involved with lots of quite a few our student events. We talk with students and also we have school competitions. So every year we host World Town Planning Day school competition. Last year we had over 200 entries from students as young as from 11 to 18 years old. So as the president, I had the privilege to select the winners this year. And some finalists, although they are as young as 11 years old, To be honest, as a professional planner, I was really impressed and touched by their long-term vision and the innovative ideas. A 12-year-old schoolgirl wrote about her visions for the future. She said, in 10 years' time, I want to see where I live becomes a green, environmental friendly, and the most sustainable area. I have planned it to be a one big community with lots of wildlife and the communal areas, and encourage people to get out and meet other residents. I think it's very important that we regenerate the area we live in, starting now, so that we adapt and grow sustainably in the future. So I think so to enable us to plan the world we need for now and the future, we need some fundamental mindset change in our society, in our profession, and thinking about how we can and how we should do our plans more efficiently. Also, in March this year, on the International Women's Day, the RTPI published a new research on women and planning. So we argued that mainstreaming gender issues in local policy and plans can remove environmental barriers and create communities that are friendlier to women, as well as men, children, the elderly, and disabled. I think about gender mainstreaming will, as I said earlier, will really strengthen the inclusivity of our community. So if you think about the whole population, say women will take half of that, and also children, the elderly, disabled, and other disadvantaged groups count more than 70% altogether of the population. So of course, I think their need should be prioritized in our town and country planning. So also our population are aging rapidly. By 2050, the world is predicted to have reached 2 billion people aged over 60. That is 1 in 5 people globally. I think by then I will be much more over 60. So I've been urging our town and country planning approaches to respond to this trend as quickly as possible. So there's a huge challenge facing us to achieve this. So I think we have to get our priorities right when we think about our town and country planning. As the RTPI president, I champion a revival spirit for modernizing the planning profession. I believe the fundamental objective of the planning profession is to create a balanced system for people, nature, and society to coexist in harmony. The planning profession plays a crucial role in making the connections between plan making and the placemaking. I think it's quite a common global problem. We sometimes think planning in a very abstract way. So we think planning is policies. So we talk a lot about great policies, but the key thing is this policy have to really applied into a real spatial scale, and the spatial scale need to be human-centered and need to relate to have integrated relationship with nature as well. As we said, nature-based solutions. So I think all these need to be considered in an integrated and inclusive way. So the scope of the planning profession, I think, should not be restricted by the planning system, and not only in built-up areas. If we use the land area in England, only 8% of the area is built-up area. The majority, 91%, is natural or unbuilt area. So we really have to think these two spaces together in an integrated way. I think we need a long-term strategic urban-rural integrated approach, consider the whole territory as one ecological entity. And in a fast-changing technological world, it is easy to get confused. Sometimes is profit our priority, or is the sustainability our priority? I think sometimes as professionals, although we know the answer, but sometimes for one reason or the other, we are not achieving what we can achieve the best. In one of our school events, we have students, they went to a council in London for a 1-week work experience. So after their 1-week experience, we asked them some questions about their experience. And then one student said, what she said, it really touched me. She said, we put sustainability as our first priority, not profit. I think we should really all think about that deeply, and then think about the deep-rooted change in our profession. Constantly, I think we need to ask ourselves and remind ourselves, for whom do we plan? What is our relationship with nature and society? And how can we, human beings, survive? Because even we talk about nature, but actually, to be honest, we are still very selfish, because we talk about nature. It's not only to save the nature, it's really for the human beings to survive. So I think answering these questions will require a reimagining of the planning, thinking beyond the professional boundaries and beyond the present day. So the key message actually I want to get out today is, I know we have lots of students today, and also I'm sure we have lots of people young in our heart. So I really want to say is, don't lose your ambition and the vision. And even when you start working and facing some day-to-day challenges and constraints in your work, I think we should never forget the vision we had and the vision our pioneers had when they set up the profession. I think there's an urgent need to cultivate thought leadership and empower diverse leadership in the planning profession, and particularly, I think, from the young people. In the past, more than 100 years ago, our pioneers took the initiative to change their world into a better place. So I think now is the time for us to carry on and rekindle the spirit. So leadership, actually, I think people confused with leadership and position. And of course, I think we do have some problem with diversity in leadership positions. But actually, leadership is not only about position. Leadership is about doing. So there is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul. So if we believe in ourselves, our vision, and our effort, we can all make a lasting difference for good. This is a quite an interesting comparison to talk about what is leadership, what is management. I think people sometimes confused about these two different concepts. I think leadership is something you feel strong about it, and then you decide to take an action to tackle the problem you identify. So in the last few years, some RTPI members came out with their own initiatives. So we have Women in Planning, BAME Planners Network, and the Neurodiversity in Planning Network. I think they are perfect examples of leadership. So during my presidency, I'm co-chairing a digital task force for planning with Professor Michael Betty in the UCL. I want to help lay a foundation for the future of the planning profession. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of our profession, because it's about future, our future generations' future. And future, is a very interesting quote, actually I saw from a book. And there is somebody's job even called futurist. I think all planners should call ourselves futurists, because future we normally treat it as a noun, but actually it's a not. It is a verb, so it requires actions. So I think actually we could take our own actions to plan the world we need. I think we need more visionary young planners and more visionary planners with young heart. So I believe the future is our young planners. I really want to encourage you to take the leadership, and I hope as the president I can help to cultivate more young thought leadership in our profession as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Young. I really appreciate your presentation, and I know that you're not able to stay for the questions and answers, but we are getting questions through, and we'll put them to the panel later on. So unfortunately, you won't be there. But if I could make just a couple of quick comments. I mean, it's so refreshing to hear somebody speak about planning as a discipline or as a profession without mentioning other professions. Without talking about interdisciplinarity and crossing boundaries and working with other people. And of course we do that, but we can only do that when we have a strong voice within our own profession already. And so I think you're the first person who ever came up, in my understanding, who talks about, we always talk about what are the skills for planners. In planning schools, we always ask that, what kind of skills should we pass on to the students? But you're the first person to mention, that I've come across, who mentions compassion, understanding, and equity, you know, those ideas as part of our planning toolkit. Whereas we tend to use a lot of management kind of language, we use a lot of technical language, but we sometimes forget that social equity, inclusion, and almost radical idea that we're talking about rebalancing in societies that are imbalanced around the world. So it's very refreshing to hear that, and and especially when you mention things like diversity and so on. And the idea that, you know, many of the people who inspired our profession, we've already heard today, we've heard people speaking about Geddes, we've heard people speaking about Howard, we've heard people, you know, that these, and Abercrombie, those people have, you know, they understood a lot of things a long time ago. But it's interesting that you're putting this into the 21st century language, and, you know, having the foresight to see the value of journalists as allies rather than simply pointing out where they're wrong. So if you have a moment, would it be possible to just maybe comment on where this insight came from, this concern for equity, this concern for diversity and for leadership? What part of your formation brought you to this way of thinking?
I was educated in China, so actually I think I have quite a unique professional journey, because when I was trained in China, I think my training was more like urban design training. So actually I really want to be a talented, I want to be a good urban designer. So I started to learn how to design human scaled public open spaces. My dream place was to go to Rome. And then the more I involved into planning, I realized actually we really have to make sure the planning policy is correct. And then I realized there was a lot of gaps between policy and the design thinking and the plan making and the place making. So I think there was a huge gap, disconnection between them. So the priorities, we have to join everything up. And there I realized actually there are lots of constraints of planners, because I think there are lots of things we can do, but we are very much constrained by the limitation of the profession. And then I realized actually the general public has so little understanding about our profession, because our code of conduct, we said actually we advance the art and science of planning for the public benefit. But when I tell the public I'm a town planner, they don't know we exist. I think it's a fundamental mistake. We must say, actually we are representing the general public, so we really need to make the general public understand our profession, so they know planners are the people we should really talk to about what we want in our community. So I think it's fundamental to re-establish that connection. And our pioneers, I think they use the planning profession the modern planning profession was only a relatively new thing, only have 120 years, the oldest. So I think actually at the time, so they didn't have a fixed idea. They think they just want to create a profession to really tackle all these comprehensive issues. So I think I always see myself as a critical friend of politicians. I have lots of mayors as my friends, so I give them advice. So I could be, I think actually it wouldn't be an ideal job if I become a mayor one day, but maybe I'm not the ideal politician, but it's really a dream job I want to be. So I become critical friends of them to give them advice. So I think there is no defined boundary to think about what is our profession. I think anything to make our society a better place is our job.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. And it's a pity that you can't stay with us. So I wish you all the very best. And thank you indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay,
thank you.
Aoife.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've all learned some great fundamentals and essentials to take forward into our career as students. So thank you.
Thank you.
So next up, without further ado, we have Dr. Stephen Weber. So Dr. Stephen Weber is joining us all the way from Canada, which is very exciting. He's a professor at Ryerson University School of Urban Regional Planning, and he'll share presentation ideas on protecting green space and redirecting development. So you can take it away whenever you're ready there, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here this morning for me, this afternoon for you. But before I get started, I just wanted to share some breaking news from Toronto that will just reinforce every stereotype people have about Canada. Is that this morning, one of the subway stations had to be closed down because a beaver got in. Right, so there's they had to close the station down and retrieve the beaver and return it to safety. So I thought, why not start with that? Because there's nothing that reinforces what Canadians are more than our national animal, which is the beaver. So there you go. So thank you. I'm pleased to be with you today. I was invited by one of my former students, Gemma, who's a grad student over there. And I want to take this opportunity. When Gemma asked me to speak today, I really, it's very difficult because Canada is such a diverse place, and I didn't really know how to approach this at first, but I thought maybe it would be informative to talk about how planning for density is taking place in the Toronto region. And just to talk about what density is, it's the intensity of land use. It's measured by an activity, so number of people, number of employees, or a building size. And density is really crucial in planning because it provides a critical mass that's necessary to encourage mixing of uses, to encourage amenities, provision, and services. So it provides that core that's necessary. It allows for the increasing of housing supply in a sustainable manner, right? It allows for locating housing in proper locations. And what's happening in Toronto in particular, it's forcing planners to rethink approaches to planning and becoming more receptive of density. Density has not always been something that planners have embraced. And it's also financially attractive to developers. As I speak today, one theme you may notice is that I do work on the relationship between planning and the real estate development industry. And in particular, it's important for planners to have a better understanding of how developers think in order to encourage outcomes that meet with overall planning objectives. So where does this begin? Well, in Toronto, before 2006, there was a period of rapid growth that was not contained in any manner. We were experiencing very dramatic sprawl outside the city of Toronto itself and outside the urbanized area. And there wasn't a mechanism in place to manage that growth in a responsible manner. And the growth began to encroach onto the green belt, and in particular, a landform known as the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is very important to Toronto because their aquifers provide a lot of the drinking water that is supplied to the region. So something needed to be done. And at that point, the province stepped in and created the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. In Canada, municipalities have very little power and authority. A lot of the decisions regarding the structure related to how planning takes place is done at the provincial level. So the province needed to step in because there wasn't a mechanism to allow the individual regions and municipalities to act in a coordinated manner. So the plan focuses on redirecting growth pressures away from the Greenbelt area and towards areas that already were built up, already urbanized areas. And encouraging intensification at densities that are appropriate for sustaining proper development. And that also required thinking about what type of housing is necessary, encouraging a mix of housing types in order to accommodate the entire population. There is also a focus on transit-oriented development. So the province has linked this plan with a regional transit plan where infrastructure investment is being made in order to redirect development pressures towards these transit nodes. And also complete communities. It's talked about in planning quite a bit up over here, but it's not really defined. It's just, it does fit in very nicely with the 15-minute community idea of work, live, play in close proximity. So that's what happened. And density in Toronto can take many forms. Toronto is a growing city. It's the 4th largest city in North America, experiencing tremendous growth pressure in part due to this redirection of growth away from the Greenbelt towards the city itself. And also other built up areas are experiencing development pressures, but not nearly as much as Toronto. So we have high density, as the slide on the left shows the redevelopment plan for a shopping center at the edge of the city. And the middle is more about infill, mid-density infill development that's being encouraged to bring people back onto the major corridors and in a manner that isn't too intrusive in the surrounding area. And then the one on the right is an example of what's called missing middle development, this idea of just through gentle density filling in gaps. That one on the right, it used to be 1 unit and it was redeveloped into 3 units. So these are the initiatives that are currently taking place in Toronto. Sorry, here. And this is just a map to give you a sense put up by the city of how intense development is in the city. As you can see here, the downtown waterfront core continues to experience a tremendous amount of development pressure. Even now with COVID, the planning department in the city has still been overwhelmed with applications for development. So it's still continuing. And the areas here are centers where they've been designated as some regional, like local nodes where development is encouraged to occur in coordination with transit. Growth trends, just to let you know, I did this presentation to give me an opportunity to get out of my house and go for a walk around the neighborhood and take pictures. So I did take some pictures of developments that are occurring. I live in downtown Toronto, so it was nice just to get out, you know. Fortunately, I've been stuck at home a lot, but the growth trends, just to give you a sense of what's going on in Toronto, just the amount of growth that's taking place. And the focus has been largely on the center city, the downtown. And the challenge has been, how do we redistribute that development pressure in a way that relieves the stress on the downtown, but also distributes people to take advantage of the resources that are available outside the downtown core. And a couple of key points to point out here is just the rise in condo ownership. Condo ownership in Toronto has become a very prominent vehicle for people to acquire homes in the city because of the density. So what happened after the province came up with this new growth plan pressures were redirected towards the city in particular. This is a situation where it's necessary to understand that you have to go beyond just aspirational definitions of, yes, we want intensification, yes, we want development to occur. You need a plan in place to guide the development. And that wasn't the situation in Toronto. And the city was completely unprepared to deal with the demand and the development for high density condos. And as a result, we had a very piecemeal approach to development where developers had individual parcels and built without any effort to coordinate with the other developers that were proposing projects in the area as well. And that in part lies with the fact that the city didn't have a very forward-thinking, updated plan in place, and the city was just reacting. Because the developments were happening so fast, there wasn't an opportunity to take a step back and talk about coordinating development. As a result, there's a lack of services and amenities because the city just kept approving developments without taking into consideration, what about park space? What about schools? What about the impact on existing infrastructure? It wasn't there. And the city also went through this phase of what's called, I call it let's make a deal, because the planning regime is set up in a way that encourages the city to negotiate with the developer, right? So they establish artificially low density levels. So whenever a developer wanted to build a high density condo, they had to enter into a negotiation with the developer. The developer in the city had to enter into a negotiation. So that created all kinds of issues as well. It led to more unaffordability because the development pressures increased land values, which translated into housing prices. And that's a huge issue in Toronto still, because students in attendance today, your counterparts in Toronto have a great deal of difficulty finding housing in the city because it's so expensive, and it does jeopardize the future of the city in the sense that we don't have places for young individuals to set up shop, to live close to where they work. There's also been a focus on ownership, and that has created trouble as well. In particular, we have a lot of speculators, people who essentially buy units to rent out. So the condos in the city have become the de facto rental market because it's more lucrative to build condos as opposed to build rental. So we have individual investors who buy units within buildings, and that creates issues as well in terms of management, landlord-tenant responsibilities, etc. And the units kept getting smaller and smaller because it became more advantageous for developers to sell more units. So they would take buildings and carve them up into smaller units. So in response, the city did come up with a plan for the downtown as well for the entire city. And it focused on changing the current system, improving the current system. And that involved unit mix. As I said, small units were being built, studios, one bedrooms that weren't suitable, especially for families. And there is a core of individuals who want to live in the city, families that want to live downtown, want to live on major transit corridors, but the unit sizes were small because that was in the developer's best interests. Housing affordability, now there are initiatives in place to try and encourage more affordable housing. Investing more in services and amenities because there is now a plan in place so development can be approached in a coordinated manner. Talking about creating a sense of place as opposed to individual sterile condo towers going up next to each other with no connection and no sense of community. And infrastructure, being aware of the fact that as we build, we are placing increasing strain on the hard infrastructure in the city. Two initiatives that in particular, I just want to mention quickly, was growing up, this idea of planning for children in new vertical communities. It's a relatively new phenomenon in the city where families, young families are moving to the city and establishing a system that will allow for the provision of services that will support that, the children and young families. And also the tall building guidelines, just imposing some, actually it's a guideline, so it's not required. So requiring developers to think about how to develop in a more pleasing manner, like in terms of density, street fronts, the relationship between the buildings and pedestrians. Just these things weren't thought of before, and it's just basically a reaction that occurred. Now, I just want to talk about a few examples here of, again, the consequence of this redirected development pressure to the city. It's advantageous when developers are able to assemble large parcels of land, that it provides an opportunity to enter in a negotiation discussion with the city on a more holistic basis. So this is an example of City Place, which is in downtown Toronto. It is between the rail corridor and the elevated highway in the downtown. And this is the proposal that came up. Again, there's more of an effort to plan in a way that provides services and amenities that are necessary to encourage or to improve quality of life for individuals living in the city. And this is just a picture down the corridor of City Place development. And City Place came out of Vancouver, and they developed something very similar in Vancouver. So they had an understanding of how to master plan in an urban setting. And these are just some examples of what happened as a result of City Place, in support of City Place. The city required the developer to provide land for a community center and a school, the first school to be built in downtown Toronto in decades. Also encouraging public space activation. This is a public arts program that the city supports and requires developers to invest in. First library that had been built in the city in a long time as well, in the downtown, came about because of this project. This is a grocery store because as condos kept going up, there wasn't an effort made to support people living in these communities with services. So there weren't grocery stores. People had to travel distances to go and shop. In a way, it was a food desert in the downtown. So this is a Loblaws that's built out of an old an old warehouse. And I show this picture here because this is the last undeveloped site in City Place. And it's now the subject of negotiation between the city and the developer. And the objective from the city's perspective is to encourage the construction of an affordable housing development there. So as development pressures have continued to increase in the city and the region itself, it's just not just the city of Toronto, but the region, there has been a push to find suitable land, which is the really underutilized sites that are served by transit, and they're in short supply. So developers are very resourceful, and they are now looking to other opportunities in order to develop for investment opportunities. And retail plazas have become very prominent as a destination, as a site for development proposals. Old industrial properties. Toronto did go through a deindustrialization phase, and we do have large parcels that are not in use at the moment. They are contaminated, but still, due to market conditions, they do provide appealing opportunities for developers to invest in. Infill sites, just looking at small areas within the downtown where development could take place as well. Parking lots, for example, and publicly owned lands. The City of Toronto is very actively now engaged in a program that is seeking partnerships with developers in order to use a publicly owned land that's underutilized or vacant. And the benefit of using publicly owned land is that there is a social imperative associated with it. The city retains ownership, and in return, they do require certain social investments to take place, most notably affordable housing. Just want to show you a few examples here of what's happening as development pressures continue in the city itself. This is the Crosstown development. It's along a light rail transit corridor that is in the process of being completed. Developers purchase sites along the corridor in anticipation of the completion of this new transit line. And what occurred here, this is an old industrial site. It's used to be the IBM site where they had research and development, and it was sold to Celestica and then sold to developers. And this is just an example of what's going on now with developers taking a more holistic approach in conjunction with negotiating with the city and coming up with density, open space, lower density here. So there's a good combination of growth that is proposed on this site. This is another example I included because this used to be an old oil refinery located at the waterfront. And that's a situation in Toronto quite a bit, is old industrial land located next to the water, Lake Ontario. And it's just been unused because of the brownfield conditions. But the market conditions are such that developers are able to purchase these sites now and redevelop and not require government subsidies, because the land market is, the real estate market is so strong, they can generate the revenues necessary to sustain a development like this. And you can see here the densities concentrated towards the lake, which gives nice views, and it also minimizes the impact on the surrounding community. And these are all mixed use as well. There's also creative infill development taking place, again, because of the need to find land. There are pressures being put on property owners to think about redeveloping their sites. On the left here is a 30-story purpose-built rental tower in downtown Toronto that had an open space, green open space next to it. And what some property owners are doing now is they are redeveloping that open space as housing. So this is going to be an 11-story mid-rise development. They'll provide necessary housing for the city, in the city. On the right is a church, and churches have become very engaged in this process as well because they have excess land. They are underutilized. Usually up here in Toronto, there are parking lots, etc. So the church entered an agreement with an affordable housing provider, a nonprofit, to build housing around the church. They actually knocked down part of the church and entered into agreement with the nonprofit housing provider to increase the amount of housing supply in the area. Now, one concept that is talked about a lot here is the missing middle. The missing middle is this gap between high-rise, which is fine for certain individuals, geared towards single individuals, but it doesn't have an appeal for families. And also the other end, which is detached and semi-detached, which is more expensive. So people who want to live in this situation can't. So this is considered to be a compromise. This is a concept that was proposed by a fellow named Paralek, who is a designer out in Oregon, as I recall. And it's the idea of creating a missing middle that addresses the demand for this housing in an urban context. And what Toronto has done, I'm going to go quickly through this, is that Toronto is now establishing corridors, which are called avenues, as destinations for some missing middle development. Now, a problem that's occurred in Toronto is, as you can see from this map here, this is the city's urban structure map that identifies how the city is projected to grow based on planning policies. So we have this area called the Yellow Belt. Yellow Belt has become very controversial in the city, and it represents the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are considered to be off limits for any type of development. And that's creating a lot of difficulty as we try to accommodate new development in a manner that's sustainable. So what the city has done is they've identified corridors here that are called avenues as the destination for intensification. Now, planners are great at coming up with aspirational plans. The avenues look great when they are put together in documents. Planners do a wonderful job with, graphics, and this is what our avenue is going to look like. So this is what the city has proposed to what should occur. But what happens is this is the reality. And this is where planners need to be aware of the fact that there's an economic decision-making process involved on part of developers that doesn't always lead to the outcomes that planners are seeking to achieve. And that's due to land acquisition. Land is in short supply and it's very expensive. Developers cannot afford to purchase the land and make money on the development. Market conditions, there are parts of the city where planners have encouraged development to occur, but it's not happening. I also teach workshops to planners over here on pro forma analysis to give an insight into how developers think. So it's just a process of going through the economics associated with the project. So if a planner was able to go through this, they'd understand that, well, the market isn't there to support what we want to see happen. And their planning requirements as well, fees and charges. Developers will always complain about how much charges they have to pay and how that just winds up increasing the cost of housing. And parking is a huge issue, that huge discussion here over how relevant, how to deal with parking, especially in locations that are transit oriented, transit accessible. Is it necessary to include all this parking? And the application processing time. And one issue that does come up a lot is the city is still concerned about the impact of development on these avenues on the surrounding communities. As you go back here, and I'll be done in just a second now, but these corridors, avenues are located amongst the Yellow Belt. So there is concern about how does this development impact the existing neighborhoods. So the city's response was to come up with this angular plane. I'm not a designer, so I can't get into the details of it, but essentially what it does is it creates step backs. Developers call us the wedding cake approach in order to create an angle that minimizes the shadowing on the surrounding neighborhood. And developers will argue, and actually more city advocates or affordable housing advocates are arguing that taking away this much housing reduces potential supply. So the message is embrace density. I know sometimes it's difficult for planners to get their heads around density being something that's positive because of the impacts it has. Being more proactive, openness to accommodating new development concepts, the difficulties developers and even nonprofits have had in proposing developments in areas that might not have seemed appropriate were an issue as well. So that's it. And just the last one, recognize developers' financial considerations. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really comprehensive and interesting presentation, especially on the different case studies. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. But next up, finally, we have, but last but not least, we have Jarrett and Michelle from Walker Associates joining us next. Walker Associates are based in Portland, Oregon, and I can't wait to hear what they have to present. Also, just to stress that not to rush through any presentations or anything, it's the last session, so take your time. Thank you.
Jarrett, we're seeing the back side of your PowerPoint, not the front side. And also, I think you're muted. Ah, there we go. That's good.
Oh, there we go. Are we all set? Great.
Yeah. Yep.
So, a little rough spot there. Okay. Now it's time to talk about public transport a little bit. There we are. And, I want to start by letting you know that this is going to be a little more applied pretty soon because we're coming to Cork. We'll be working on the bus network redesign, part of the Bus Connects process for the NTA. So although it's premature for us to actually say anything very much about Cork, you will have a chance now to see what we do in these approaches up close very soon. There we are. So quickly about who we are. We're a small consultancy that's devoted entirely to the network, the design of public transport networks and the policy around them. So we have a long track record in redesigning bus networks in particular all over the world. There are just a few examples. But the important thing about us is that, and about our approach to this, is that our goal is not for us to recommend what you should do. Our goal is always to foster the conversation that leads to your own local confidence about what you should do, and your own leadership's ability to support that decision. So I will sometimes say that I'm a consultant who aspires never to make a recommendation. In my ideal world, we would simply foster the conversation that leads the community to its own sense of what to do. Here's where the project fits. You're all familiar with the Cork Metropolitan Area Transport Strategy, which has a whole bunch of pieces. So inside of the bus piece of that strategy, this is now part of the process of implementing that strategy. There are several different areas of activity. We're specifically focused on the network design. That is to say, the pattern of routes and schedules as they operate across the city. So one of the reasons public transport is difficult to talk about is that people bring many different goals to it. When we're talking about firefighting, for example, there's no question about what the overriding goal of firefighting is, but there's a lot of question about what the overriding goal of public transport is, and often these goals seem to pull against each other. Are we focused primarily on the sustainability benefits that we deliver, including in both land use and in reducing VMT? Are we interested in reducing congestion? Is it about social inclusion? Is it about about equity, as we also call it? Is it about economic growth? I believe it's about all of those things, but that we have a problem in the business, which is that we tend to measure all these things separately and not look at the thing that, if we could focus on it, would actually deliver on all of them. And so I want to introduce that idea briefly, which is the idea of the wall around your life. Now, this is not an idea that we invented, but it's an idea that we are particularly finding needs to be put at the center of public transport thinking in particular, but it has relevance to land use thinking generally. The proposal from the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, to create a 15-minute city is essentially an application of this idea, but we need to apply it much more broadly to how transport systems function. Here's a person. She's in a city that is full of possible destinations. In 45 minutes on some mode of transport, let's say she wants to use public transport, there's an area she could get to. There's an area she could cover in that distance. 45 minutes, arbitrary number appropriate to a trip that you make once a day. You can pick different numbers and see the different concentric walls. So her access to jobs is the number of jobs in that area. Likewise, her access to education, her access to shopping, her access to medical, her access to social opportunities, those can all be calculated based on what is in that area as opposed to outside of it. So this is the wall around your life, because outside this wall are things you can't do, exactly as if there were a wall that you couldn't get beyond. There are things you can't do, jobs you can't hold, schools you can't go to, people you will never meet. And so this is a fairly powerful idea, and it's an idea that connects fairly fundamentally with what ordinary people actually want once we figure out how to describe it the right way. So here's an example. You may know that we worked for several years on a redesign of the bus network in Dublin, which has yet to be implemented. It's to be implemented over the next few years. But here's an example of how we use the tool. You imagine someone who lives next to Dublin City University, and imagine her asking, where can I go in 45 minutes? And understand that the real question behind that question is, where could I work? Where could I go to school? Where could I do something that involves going there about once a day? So that's a lot of questions about her freedom and opportunity and about access to opportunity in the city generally. So there's a blob that's the answer to that question. And then there's a proposed change to that network which changes that blob. And then we can calculate the difference. Red is where she has lost a little bit of access there at the top. Blue is where she has gained it. And as a result of the plan, and I can say she can reach 43% more jobs. And it's not very much of a stretch to say that she has 43% more opportunities in her life. So this is much bigger than transport. This is about the quality of her life in the sense of the availability of options in her life. In the US especially, we tend to throw around the word freedom, and this is kind of what that is, isn't it? Because freedom is the availability of choices before you, the ability to do lots of different things, and that's exactly what we're measuring. Then, of course, we can aggregate that. We can map up the city and color each zone according to how much the access has improved in that particular area. And we can average across that and say something like the average Dubliner could reach 20% more jobs in 30 minutes, which was one of our sound bites. And then we can also say, all right, how does the average low-income Dubliner experience this? What is it for various groups of interest in the United States? Of course, we're very concerned about race and ethnicity. We do these calculations for different racial or ethnic groups. So, and that's how we bring in equity, because we encourage equity to focus on the question of, are we providing as much or better access to opportunity for disadvantaged groups as we are for the population as a whole? And here's the extraordinary thing. This is inside of a bunch of different goals that people usually think are completely different. What is the purpose of the city? The purpose of the city is to put people close to opportunities. And so when we measure people's ability to get to opportunities, we're measuring the functionality of the city in relation to its most fundamental purpose. Likewise, as I mentioned, we can talk about access for excluded or disadvantaged groups. So the whole world of equity or social inclusion, or whatever you want to call it. Finally, we're also talking about the potential of a network design to actually attract customers. And the way this works is that if you think about this blob, the amount of stuff in this blob represents also the likelihood that any particular person looking up a trip they have to make will find that public transport offers them a reasonable travel time. So we're finding that that is really effectively describes how the design of the network affects the number of riders. Different, of course, from all sorts of other factors, exogenous factors that send the number of riders up or down, as we all know from the past year. But because this is so tied to how many riders we can attract, all of the environmental and congestion benefits come along with it too, because all of those benefits arise from public transport being ridden, not just from public transport existing. And finally, as I said, sheer liberty or freedom is what we're describing here. And I believe that's something that people value separate from all of the other kinds of goals that we normally measure when we're doing planning. Another great thing about access is that it integrates the impacts of transport and urban development. You can actually explore trade-offs between transport and urban development. You can use this in structure planning because we increase access in two ways. We expand the wall, which is what transport does, and we put more stuff inside the existing wall, which is what development does. It's also important to notice one of the things that I find very powerful is that I am very, very certain about the calculation of access. because it's really a geometric calculation from the transport network plus the land use pattern. By contrast, as soon as you try to predict human behavior, as soon as you try to talk about customer desires or predict what customers will do, you're in the world of social science. And to all the social sciences scientists listening in, I admire your profession enormously. There's an enormous amount of value it provides, but we will never be as sure of a social science insight as we are about a geometric insight. And because I can explain the journey, the process of getting from network to access purely geometrically, I can just bring a lot more people along who may want to quarrel with social science insights, but have no hope of quarreling effectively with a geometric insight. The other thing to remember, if you're coming from the freedom or liberty perspective, is that when we talk about prediction, we're not talking about freedom, right? Because freedom is fundamentally the freedom to do something unpredictable. When I'm talking to groups of young people, I will sometimes have to break the news to them that the foundation of all of our transport modeling systems that predict human behavior is that when they're the age that their parents are now, they'll behave exactly the way their parents did, because that's what we're fundamentally doing when we take their parents' behavior today as a prediction of their behavior 20 years from now. They mostly don't like to hear that, and they have every right to not like to hear that, because we hope instead that they will surprise us in all kinds of ways that will prove the model's wrong. I just don't have to go there. I don't have to get into that kind of model to talk about access. Further reading on this, some great leadership that's happening in the academic space. If you're interested in this academically, two sources you should particularly look at: the University of Minnesota's Accessibility Observatory, which produces an analysis called Access Across America, which I think would give you a lot of ideas for how to bring this tool to Europe, and also the Transport Access Manual just completed by Professor David Levinson and Professor David King, both leaders in this field. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing in Cork and working through in Cork. And that is this business of network redesign. There's a lot of confusion about what network redesign is, what it means to redesign a network. So I just want to step through it very quickly. What we do in a network redesign is that we design a bus network as though we were designing it for the first time. That is to say, although we'll have lots of data about the existing bus network, if we start with the idea of just tweaking the existing bus network, we're going to end up with a bias in favor of the present and the past, and particularly in favor of the past, since there are always historic reasons why the bus network is the way it is. So we have to do the mental exercise of imagining there were no network and drawing it, because that's the only way to make sure that we're drawing a map for the present and the future. So that means too that there's a step of, lots of people want to tell us about history to explain why the network is the way it is. That's great. But ultimately we have to set aside the history to make sure we're planning not for the history, but for the presence of the future. The other challenge is that everything we do in a network redesign will be controversial. If you followed any of the news from Dublin, you know that there's a great deal of public anger that's associated with changing anything that people are used to. So it's very important as we think about network redesign that we not anticipate that political response, that we not say, oh, we mustn't draw that because Mrs. Jones, because Mrs. Murphy lives here and she knows this counselor and it will never fly. Because in fact, an effective network redesign makes all kinds of people angry for all kinds of local reasons, but it also produces a citywide benefit that is measurable and that can be sold directly to decision makers in such a way that it becomes acceptable for not everyone to be happy about. And finally, making hard choices visible. There's a theory in consulting that our job is to conceal the really difficult choices that go into a network plan, to protect the public, to protect the decision makers from having to think about really difficult trade-offs. Do we want more of this or do we want more of that? The sorts of trade-offs that everyone experiences in drawing a budget, for example. We have the opposite view, which is that it's our job to make those choices visible so people can talk about them. Also then, so that people understand when they see the final plan that hard choices had to be made. And so that even if they don't agree that the choice was made, at least they don't come away thinking that we're just idiots for not having done it their way, that there was actually a difficult decision that had to be made about it. So here's an example of a really difficult choice. In Cork, as in Dublin, as in many cities, many people are accustomed to a direct bus to their destination. So this is an abstract city with 3 residential areas and 3 places that people commute to. And there's a common way to design a network for this city, which is that you draw a direct route from every residential area to every activity center. And in this little abstract city, that gives me 9 different bus routes. The other way to do it is to have just 3 bus routes, which means that 2/3 of the trips in this network require an interchange. However, because there are 3 bus networks instead of 9, I can afford to run these bus routes 3 times as often. So if those buses come every 30 minutes, these buses come every 10 minutes. And as a result, my trip is actually going to be faster, because even if I have to make an interchange, I have saved so much time on the wait that it is worth the 5 minutes to do the interchange. I actually get where I'm going sooner. And if you have more residential areas and more activity centers, a bigger city, this benefit actually gets bigger. And so at the scale of Dublin, we did an enormous amount of this. It was very controversial. Lots of people weren't happy about it. But it was part of how we dramatically expanded where people can go in the city. So to sum up, what we're doing when we're doing network design is we're looking at the whole picture. We're planning for the present and the future rather than the past. We're carefully not anticipating reaction. We're separating facts from values. Now, this is to say that sometimes questions are going to come up that really are questions about whether you value this more than that. Access, it's not as bad as you think, because as I've argued, when we look at access, we're actually looking at benefits to all kinds of different things that people care about. But sometimes conflicts do come up. In some American cities, for example, we have the problem that Black people tend to live in particularly inaccessible places. And so a network that is designed to focus mostly on ridership and all of its benefits tends not to serve them very well. So in that situation, we have a conflict between equity goals, which argue for serving them more, and goals such as sustainability and congestion mitigation, which all arise from focusing on running where high ridership is possible. So there's a sustainability versus equity trade-off in some of those places, and that's very painful. Where we find that trade-off, we don't quietly answer it for you buried in technical work. We make it visible because we want everyone to understand what this is and why it's hard, so that they'll understand whatever decision was made, even if they don't agree with it. We will describe freedom and opportunity outcomes, access outcomes. And again, as I've said, we'll ask people about the real trade-offs. You'll see in the public outreach process that we do, the public consultation process that we do, we're asking people really difficult questions about whether they want more of this or more of that. And so that more people are invited to think about this from the NTA's perspective. They're to think about this from the perspective of, okay, if you were in the NTA's position, what would you do? Don't tell us what you would do in your situation. Tell us what you would do in their situation once you understand their situation. And it's our job to help explain their situation. So thanks very much for your time. And I certainly look forward to more discussion.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Jarrett. I don't know if Michelle, were you proposing to talk a little bit as well, or?
Thank you. I don't have any slides. Jarrett and I developed those together, but I'm available for the question and answer. And I'll be managing our network redesign work in Cork shortly. So I'm also a voice that some people might hear from later on in the year.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks for really interesting, a really interesting session, everybody. So we've been getting questions in the questions and answers, and they might be coming in a scattered way. So if I could just dive in, maybe straight away, Stephen, I really like your greater golden horseshoe. One of our colleagues speaks about the importance of spatial metaphors. You know, the idea that you can get across a complex or important idea visually in something like that. So it's really interesting that you tackled it in that way. I'm interested in what you said about how the regional governments seem to have to step in to take the lead on that urban containment problem. Did I pick up that correctly, that it really had to be pushed from a higher level of government?
Actually, just to give you a bit of background, in Canada, the municipalities have very little standing. It's up to the province.
Yes.
So what occurred at the time was that the region, the Greenbelt is divided up among several regions who are acting in their own interests.
Sure.
And so each would approach development in a very self-centered incremental manner. So that's where the province had to step in, basically. And it's a regional plan. It gets confusing because we do have municipal regions,
sure,
but it's a regional plan that transcends a number of regions in Southern Ontario. So it's really a provincial initiative.
And could I ask, in that sense, that provincial entity that drives that scale of thinking, is that a powerful political entity that has buy-in from the citizens? You know, where there's direct elections to that entity, and that people have a genuine sense of democratic engagement. That it's not just a layer of government that pops in every now and then and pushes them around. That they have a buy-in or affinity with it.
It's an interesting question. The province is quite dominant in local life, so yes, they are the go-to, like they are regarded in that sense, but I don't think many people look to the provincial politicians as the guardians, right? Like the plan has been put in place and the responsibility has been shifted to the municipality. So basically the province has said, here's what we want. Now it's up to you to change your plans to accommodate our regional objective. So it is a little, the discussion takes place more at the local municipal level.
Sure.
And they are responsible for implementing it, but really the provincial level is the one that sets the guidelines.
That's so interesting, because what we've been doing in Ireland lately is readjusting the way we do different planning functions at different levels, but it doesn't quite match with our the way citizens engage with it. So it's an interesting exemplar for sure. A couple of things that came up, Stephen, from the questions as well were,
Sure.
This idea that, that with this development and the large pressure for development, how is the city dealing with things like gentrification and the relative difficulty of making spaces available for arts and entertainment and cultural activities, the kind of things that are probably low on the land speculation hierarchy, let's say. Toronto seems to do that quite well though.
Not as well as they could. The issue of gentrification has been a very difficult one to address up here. I keep saying up here, I'm sorry, I'm over here from where you are, but
you're probably up there as well.
Yeah. The problem has been that there hasn't been enough attention paid to preserving neighborhoods and also encouraging the provision of affordable housing. And that's changing now, where the city is pursuing different initiatives. One is called inclusionary zoning, where developers are going to be required to incorporate a certain percentage of affordable units in new developments. The problem is that the city had initially, this is an example of the conflict between the city and the province. The city wanted it to be citywide, but the province has changed that, and it's only applicable to locations near transit nodes. So that's reducing the ability to make this a truly citywide initiative. The question about the arts has become very controversial up here. We are losing venues at a rapid rate to condos, basically. And condos don't have a very good name amongst that segment of the population. And that's something that is really challenging councillors, because councillors want more, aside from affordable housing, there just needs to be more housing built. The idea being that more supply will reduce the price of housing. And there have been some venues lost. If anyone's interested, I encourage you to Google a place called Sneaky D's, which is in downtown Toronto. It's a landmark at Ryerson College. If anybody's read the Scott Pilgrim versus the World comic book series, it's the center, it's one of the main locations. It's an iconic place, but there's recently been a proposal now to put a condo on that site, and people are very upset about it. And the city is now grappling with how do we balance encouraging more housing, yet preserving these facilities. And there hasn't been something that has been come up with yet. So
they're very interesting. And I was interested as well in the questions that came up about how we might have a number of different priorities. Say, for example, transit-oriented development is one of our priorities. But if we also have a priority for affordable housing, and we also have a set of priorities around the provision of open space, they're not always compatible. And whether Toronto and cities like, and it probably comes into your presentation as well, Jarrett, you know, the idea that that we might need to prioritize decisions that we make. And is there an argument to say that you should have a hierarchy that for example, transit-oriented development always trumps the provision of open space, or that it always trumps affordability? Or is there an argument like that to be made?
Sure, you can take it.
I don't think it's ever that simple. I don't think any use ever has an absolute veto over any other use, because it's in the nature of the city that there are always several things that want to be in the same place, and you always have to negotiate them. I think that what matters, though, is that each of the things that we need to optimize needs to have a citywide plan for that shows where that thing really, really needs what it needs very, very badly. Because for public transport, for example, you know, we don't need bus lanes all over the city, but there are certain places where we absolutely need bus lanes. And, you know, we have the problem in the US that, you know, there are these federal policies that say, well, we'll get this funding if 50% of the service is in exclusive lanes. And you can satisfy that by building lanes where you don't need them, because where you don't need them is where it's politically easy to build them. So, you know, a lot of problems like that. So yes, that's how we have to, that's how we always have to manage these conflicts, by looking at what each thing needs and where it needs it most urgently to make sure that it all fits together.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And could I put just another question that's come up? I don't know if Michelle or Jarrett would like to. I was interested in your blob diagram to show how you would redesign a bus network based on where the notional citizen begins her day and where she might get to on a revised bus network. Is it common to do that same exercise in reverse? Because, you know, the assumption we often make is that workplaces are actually in the correct location. But workplaces they just pop up in all sorts of locations, especially if you have a planning regime that's a little bit lax. I mean, we sometimes mix up business parks with retail parks, with office-based industry, with, you know, workplaces that need members of the public to visit them, and so on. And it reminds me of what Stephen said about the downtown locations and the importance of them. So is that exercise done in reverse? I was wondering, Jarrett.
Absolutely.
Yes, it is done in reverse. And, you know, so Jarrett showed the maps of blobs, isochrones, and then he showed a map that we produced years ago of the draft Dublin network, and it showed access across the whole city. So from each point in the city, how many more jobs would be accessible. But you can do the same thing in reverse and produce a map across the whole city that shows for each workplace, each place in the city that people might go to, whether for work or for school or for shopping, how many residents can get to that workplace, how many residents can reach that site. And that then speaks to the value of land. And this is the type of analysis that major real estate investors do all the time. The value of the land depends on the use, but say the use is a retail shopping center. Well, the value of the land is how many residents can reach this center, you know, would make it part of their habit to come here. And so we can do the same thing that shows where are the places that have a great deal of access to people in this network? And therefore, where are the places that are best for locating major job centers, educational facilities, social services, and so on?
Brilliant. Yeah, because I think one of the things that we find as well is that where workplaces choose to locate can really distort the urban fabric, and especially if you've got open space and nature-based solutions in mind, they're pretty hard-nosed, and sometimes workplaces end up in unusual locations with the promise of being able to retrofit a bus. When a developer says, "Oh, we can put on a special bus service to get our workers to our IT factory," the retrofitting a special bus service is almost an admission that we've got it wrong locationally. But
yes. And also, if you do the access analysis, even let's assume that someone is funding the special bus service, and of course, maybe it's not decided who will come up with the funding for the special bus service. But if you do assume that someone is funding it with new monies, once you do that access analysis, you find that it's still not very accessible. One bus route to one out-of-the-way workplace does not make great access to workers. Actually, really good access to workers comes from being in a connected network where people can reach you from multiple routes coming from many other places.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, and maybe Stephen, if you wanted to come in as well, if we're talking about cities which have, a lot of direct investment in, say, high-tech sectors, where the workers or the workforce come from other locations from around the world, for example, it's not just the indigenous workforce, a knowledge-based economy, let's say. And sometimes we find a different commuting desire pattern between new migrants. People might move to a city because of the lifestyle, because of the work opportunities, and they'd be quite happy never to own a car, or quite happy not to live in the suburb. And then, but for the indigenous, let's say, the local community, to get, let's say, middle-class people to leave their car behind and take the bus, there's a cultural difference. I mean, in Ireland, for example, now you'll find it quite regularly, you'll see many people with PhDs from mainland Europe happily taking the bus to their IT workplace, whereas their Irish counterpart would never dream of taking a bus because it's not in their cultural, the public transport is seen as an inferior way of traveling. So that those cultural shifts need to be encouraged, don't they? Are we finding those issues in Toronto and in the places you've worked as well? Jarrett and Michelle?
I can really quickly speak to the fact that, yes, it's an ongoing discussion. I'll call it discussion charitably up here. It's been called, anytime there's been a proposal to redirect investment to public transit or even active transportation, bike lanes or whatever, the reaction's always, it's going to impact my ability to get around in a car. In fact, I'm sure it's been used in other cities, but the term "the war on the car" has been used quite a bit up here, and it does break down towards the more between the suburban population in Toronto and the inner city population as well. And it's, yeah, I mean, it is something. It does exist, and what has also happened, and I'm sure Jarrett and Michelle probably familiar with this if you know it, Toronto, is that we've gotten hung up on this idea of investing in heavy transit, like subways, right? And subways that are expensive, are limited in terms of their capacity to service the population. And as a result, we haven't had anything. We have not had much transit investment in Toronto because we've had this back and forth about LRTs versus subway. And that is rooted in this idea that subways are sexy, right? People want subways because they're more of a symbol of progress. So, and that goes back to the people who are more interested in promoting cars. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Yes, there is that.
It's very interesting. And also, I don't know if a little bit of an experience in Ireland, I'm sure, Jarrett, you'll be aware of that in Dublin. When the tram system was introduced, instead of getting people to move from their car, they moved from other forms of public transport. Now, there was a bit of a glow around certain high prestige locations where it became popular to take the tram and have meetings on the way and stop off at a coffee shop. But generally speaking, you were switching between public transportation nodes rather than getting people to leave the car behind.
And there's nothing wrong with that if we were replacing 15 buses with one tram, because that in itself liberates enormous amounts of resources, because you have to remember that the cost of operating public transport is mostly labor. If I replace 5 buses with one tram, I have 4 buses that I can run somewhere else and expand where people can go. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the tram system in Dublin is working fairly well now that it's actually connected in this one network. And I think the metro project will certainly add to that. I do want to say something about this class question, because of course, you know, the United States is even more obsessed with this and obsessed with it in a different way. And in our experience, people use public transport if public transport is useful. And the more we can focus on that, the more we can just bypass all of the class questions and just get down to the business of what does it mean for, what does it take to get people to use public transport? The reality is we all benefit from more people using public transport, even if they're low-income people, because those low-income people would also be in, you know, a 1985 car in front of us on the freeway if they were not on public transport. So, so I think, so, you know, part of what I try to do with this is think of the low-income passenger as a pioneer, as the person who uses the service before it's necessarily everything that a wealthier person would use, and therefore gives us a base to build on as we grow it. But the fundamental thing is usefulness, and I guess partly I think about this way. Maybe people talk about changing the culture, and I don't know how to change the culture, but I do know how to make public transport more useful. That's something we can measure, and we know it works.
And Brendan, what you say about the tram, the patrons of the tram being the old bus patrons, is a demonstration of that. People are using the tram because it's useful. And before it was a tram, it was a useful bus, and they used that. And so it's super, you know, if you can run more efficient service by making it a tram rather than a bus, but it doesn't cause patronage. The technology of tram, as opposed to bus, doesn't itself cause patronage, or at least not enough that anyone can measure. What causes the patronage is the usefulness. And my observation from working in the, you know, in the cities that have many, many immigrants in the United States and Canada, which is consistent with what you're saying about the European PhDs, is that people come with their culture and they come with their habits. And so they come, and if back where they come from, they rode transit all the time, then they start out that way in their new home. But over time, they, you know, if they find that it's not very useful, that they would be more free if they had a car. You know, if all of the difficulties of life, childcare, shopping, you know, safety, if somehow all of that, you know, implies that they should be using a car instead, then the rational thing to do is get a car, and they'll eventually, you know, spend the money on the car. And we see this all the time in the United States, where we receive many immigrants from, you know, countries where transport is the only mode for most people. And they arrive and they assume that they'll use transport, and then they find just how poor our transport is in most cities and most places. And after struggling with it for 2 or 3 years, they finally save up enough money to get a car, and they're gone. So there's culture, but I think over time, usefulness trumps culture in determining how much transport actually gets ridden.
Super.
There's actually an interesting situation in Toronto that recently occurred. Is the province built a line, a light rail line from Union Station to Pearson Airport. And the intention was essentially just to transport people between the airport and downtown. And they've had minimal stops on this line. They put the infrastructure there. I mean, it's going through underserved neighborhoods as well, low-income neighborhoods where there are jobs, but they didn't build stations. And now they're trying to retrofit and think about, well, maybe we should start building stations. But it's going to slow down the commute. I mean, the trip from downtown to the airport. But also what's happened is the stations were, the places where there were stations, people started to use it. People could get downtown much quicker using the UP Express than they can going through the local bus network. So it's something where I think almost in a way what's happening now is there's a demand to improve the relevance of this this line that really was just meant, it was built for the Pan Am Games to show up Toronto. Toronto has always tried to get big scale events like the Olympics, and we never have. And we got the Pan Am Games, and we thought, well, now we have to get people from the airport downtown. And now people are essentially demanding that there are more stations built along this line. And it's going to wind up being a useful investment in terms of getting people around the city.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought that up, Stephen. And I want to say two things about it. I just want to give the personal experience with that line. So, I am a business traveler a lot of the time because we travel until last year, we travel all around the world consulting on public transport. And I had a job in Mississauga. And so I flew into the airport and I went to that train station. It's beautiful. I mean, it's a glass, cathedral. It's gorgeous. And I get into the train station and it's incredibly quiet and beautiful and clean. I don't see any trains, but there's ticket machines. And I discover two things. One, it doesn't go, I can't use it. It's useless because I'm not going to downtown Toronto, right? So I'm going to Mississauga, not useful. Two, the fare is very high. I don't remember what it was, but it's expensive. It's not a normal transport fare. And three, I can't buy any tickets at the ticket machines for the buses I'm actually going to need to take to my destination. So I get out of there and I go and find the bus station. And it takes me a long time to find the bus station at the airport because it's down multiple levels. And it's basically in what feels like the sub-basement of the airport. And I stand on a dirty curb at these tilted poles for the bus services that actually go to many different places in the Toronto metropolitan area. And that's where I get my bus to Mississauga. And I think it's such a great parable about elite projection. This is something Jarrett often talks about, that if you take the experiences and the desires and the habits of elites like us, honestly, the business travelers, and you design a service that is perfect for the elites. So it's a very beautiful, clean train that goes straight to downtown Toronto, really fast to the hotels, right? Doesn't slow down the business traveler with any other stops. And then you can charge a very high price for it because this person, of course, can afford it. Well, there are too few elites for that to result in much patronage. You just don't get many riders when you design for, the 5% of people who are, and it's often the 5% of people who are making these decisions and who are certainly influencing the culture. So that we love that as a demonstration of elite projection and the types of services it can result in, and why, as Jarrett just said, if you want to design for high patronage, if you want the low carbon emission, world-changing network, you don't design something that's perfect for the elites. You design for lower and middle income people. And that means getting them to all the places in the metro area they need to go, not just the downtown hotels. It means a reasonable fare. Lots of connections, and it doesn't necessarily mean the high cost touches that elites really want, the Wi-Fi or the glistening, architecture. Not that good architecture shouldn't be available democratically to all people, but it's not as important as the usefulness of the service to a wide range of people. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. So for, in a lesson, I think for Ireland, the European PhDs coming over to work in IT companies, let's not design something that's perfect for them either. If you want high patronage, you design something that's workable, that's good enough for a really wide range of people, including some of the European PhDs. But you don't focus narrowly on any one group of people and do something that's just perfect for them, because it ends up not being workable for everybody else.
Sure.
But it's interesting because now the UP line is being spun as something that can be a local service.
Which is fantastic.
It's going to connect to the Eglinton LRT, that new line that's going from the west end to the east end of the city. And there's a realization that, as you mentioned, the approach catering to the elites didn't really generate the patronage necessary to sustain it. And it's also unfair to the people who watch the train go by, there's in their neighborhood, they watch the train go by and they can't access it. And it's also, they are talking about, they've reduced the fares already. The initial fares are ridiculous, and they've reduced that. So yes, it's a good point.
Yeah, so being able to retrofit it to make it useful to more people is really great.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, folks. So we're going to wrap up this Q&A there in a moment, but and there was one quite interesting question. I think it might be a little bit unfair put it to you, because I think people are, and I'm saying to Michelle and Jarrett, I think people are trying to get you to anticipate what solution you might come up with for Cork, and whether you feel that, and I know you're going to design it completely fresh, as if there had ever been a network before, but whether the concepts like the spines and the branches and the orbital routes and all that are part of your menu or your recipe that you might draw on for Cork. Is it too early to ask you that question for the Cork situation?
It is too early. We're just organizing data, geographic data, and getting a feel for the place. Yeah. I will say that certainly the scale that, Dublin and Cork are very different scales, so that may imply different strategies in network design. And also that, there are different constraints in the two places, and the alternatives that people have in terms of their own personal transport are also different. So we do expect it to be different, but we don't know at this point exactly how. Jarrett, do you want to add to that?
No, absolutely. Yeah. We have a giant toolbox, but we would never say at this point what tools will end up being relevant.
Very good. So if I could just ask one tiny other thing, you spoke, Jarrett, about the importance of being brave and to say perhaps unpopular things, and often this comes out to being, where the clash between a rational argument and maybe power games or things that go on in the political domain. But sometimes somebody has to cut through all of that with something quite pure and clear and brave that has to be said. And you spoke about the idea of the consultant coming in. Now, sometimes in the public sector, there is a strategy which says that if you can't get your really good ideas across for political reasons or other reasons, the best thing to do is get a consultant in, because the consultant then doesn't have the kind of embedded heritage in the institution, and they can go off and into the sunset. And so that's one perception, that if you want something difficult to be an idea to be sold to the political world, then you get a consultant, you hire them and they'll do it. And, because they know, the internal expert won't be able to get that across. There's another perception though, of course, which is that, that the hired gun will say, well, what do you want me to say? I'll say it with in a nice glossy document with much better graphics than you would do internally. So, but that role, it's kind of jokey, but I think that role is quite important, isn't it? In the way that expertise interacts with institutions, interacts with the wider political sphere. Am I right that we need to address that a little bit?
So, I mean, I have a little bit of a professional profile. I've written a book, some people know who I am. And so a lot of people and some clients will say, well, when Jarrett says this thing, he'll say it with more authority. So let him say that. It has to be a thing that I am willing to say. So the thing you suggested about the client telling me what to say, that's unethical. We don't do that. But, certainly there's a role in being heard saying something that the locals were not heard in saying. But let me say one other thing to that too, which is you talked about saying the brave or controversial thing, and we're going to try to ask the controversial question. The question that folks may find it uncomfortable to think about, but that is the question you have to actually answer. So whatever issue we're talking about, even if we're talking about something as existential as climate, I'm always framing the question as, how do you weigh your commitment to climate against this other thing you're for? How do you weigh this against that? We all know how this works in budgeting. When we draw up a budget, we have to make exactly those kinds of decisions. So again, that helps me to not appear to be somebody who's imposing my values in any way or imposing my culture in any way, but simply, asking questions and doing the work of showing why you really have to think about those questions.
Super. So I think, thanks very much indeed, folks. I think we're coming to the end of the Q&A. I mean, it could go on and on. I think at this stage, it's probably time to invite Niall Cusson, if he can hear us, to perhaps turn on his camera. A lot of the things that you're talking about from international perspectives are things that Ireland, in its planning system at least, is wrestling with. And there have been a lot of changes in the last perhaps 5 years or so in the way planning is delivered